Welcome to Culmination, where we're not experts, but we sure have a lot to say. In the process of becoming our best self, I have with me the Latin teacher, Mr. Sean Minion, to discuss the theory of linguistic relativity. And with that, let's get started. So, would you mind explaining the theory?
Yeah, so the basic theory of linguistic relativity is that language influences the person who's speaking its perspective of the world and um, how they view certain things. And there's somewhat of a little bit of determinism in there, and the fact that your language might even determine what you believe about certain things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, if it's okay with you, I'd like to start off with an example because this might be a hard idea. This might be groundbreaking because most of us probably are only familiar with one, maybe two languages at best. We were kind of plugged into the matrix a little bit too much to realize that there might be something deeper to this.
Mm-hmm.
I've sent you a picture, and there's two circles of green squares in there. You see that picture?
Yeah, I'm looking at the picture and I'll put it on screen when I make the video.
Awesome. Now, let's start with the right circle. Can you find the different color in that circle?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Which one is it?
It's white. No, I'm kidding. It's blue.
It's the blue one. Right up at the second from left at the very top. Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Now take a look at that picture on the left. Can you tell me what color is different on that circle?
The blue is green.
Yes. So do you see which colors are different inside that circle of colors? I guess that's my question. So looking inside that circle, not thinking about the other circle of colors, do you see which box has a different color than the rest? Or
So,
do
like,
they
I'm
all have the
looking
same?
at the left picture, like, looking at the circle itself or the squares that make
Yeah, yes, that circle of 12, I believe, 12 boxes of colors. Do you see which color is different
Uh,
amongst that circle?
no.
No, that's good. That's good answer. That's what I wanted you to answer. So,
Well, without being like, "Whoa," now that I think about it, some of the squares are looking a little darker, but I think
uh,
that's just me being bad at seeing.
do you want to like hazard a guess which shade is different than the rest?
Um, Again, I might be having problems, but it looks like the 4 diagonal squares, the ones that aren't paired with 2s, are
Okay,
darker, but the one where the blue one would be is lighter.
okay. Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. Well, the reason why I bring this up, hold that thought for a second, and I'm going to tell you about a linguistic problem. And it goes back to my background because I study ancient languages. Particularly, I know well Latin and ancient Greek. And
Mhm.
there was a problem that classicists were looking at in that in the ancient poet Homer never describes the sea as blue.
Hmm.
And they pored over the text and they found that the sea is either bright or the most common description is the wine dark sea. And that raised some questions about why is it never called just straight up blue? Because most of us would probably say, what color is the sea? Blue. What color is the sky? Blue.
Well,
They've
it's just
also
a
really,
reflection, right?
sorry, say that again.
Isn't water just like it's blue because it's reflecting the sky?
I believe the opposite, that the sky is reflecting the sea because the water clears out some of um, the UV spectrum, stuff like that. But you and me could agree that we would probably call the sea blue, right?
You mean it's not magenta?
Not magenta. Wine
I
dark,
might have to
maybe.
look at it again, but I'll take your word for it.
So while people were going through this discovery, they started to propose the theory that maybe because the author of this epic, Homer, didn't speak English, he didn't view colors the same way. Now, I want to jump back to that example I gave you. There is a tribe called the Himba tribe in Northern Africa. And have you actually seen Black Panther movie?
No, I have not.
Oh no, it's a great movie. I highly recommend it. But a lot of the costume designs are based off them.
Okay.
Um, when they look at that circle of squares, the one that we'll start with is the right one. They cannot tell you which one is different. They cannot discern that blue square from the rest of them.
Is the color not in the vocabulary?
Good idea. And then we'll jump to this. But let me tell you this: when they showed these same tribe members that other square that looked very similar, immediately right away they picked out the box that was a slight bit lighter than the others, a slight bit lighter than the others.
Wait, that one
And
actually is lighter?
yes, there is one
I
that
see it. It looks lighter.
the same blue box, if you, the equivalent box on the other is slightly lighter, like I think like 10 shades lighter,
Yeah,
if you're going through that massive color scale from there.
that's what I was seeing.
And it was interesting that you picked it out. Most people, when I show it to a group, there's wide differences and disagreements about which one is the right. And some people get it right away, but they can move that square anywhere on the circle. And they found that these tribe members were able to pick it out near instantaneously, where that blue box was full. They eventually could figure out that was the one that was different, but that was throwing them through a loop. And you answered the question. It's because their language of colors is much more different than ours that they have trouble understanding that blue.
Hmm.
We have a fairly complex language where we have, maybe like six major colors: white, black, red, yellow, green, blue,
Well, we
purple.
have the primaries, the secondaries, and then it gets a little more confusing with tertiary.
Exactly. It can be really complicated.
Yeah.
The Himba tribe has only three words for color.
Oh,
Yes. I'm gonna have to pull it up for a second, but their first color is buru, which is a combination of green and blue together.
okay.
The
Oh, which is
sec
why they can't see the blue square.
Why they can't see the blue square is because their language has determined what they can be able to see. And the other two colors are dambu and zuzu, which essentially just means light and dark. So why they're able to see that green square really well, as far as we know, is that their vocabulary has geared their mind to help them differentiate between lighter and darker colors. And
Hmm.
even that slight change of shade stands out to them because they use that
Yeah.
language all the time.
Okay.
And same biology, nothing DNA different. The language has determined what they're able to do.
Hmm.
Um, so that got scholars and linguists thinking, and actually, there's a proposed evolution of how you view colors. The very basics of a language differentiate between light and dark primarily, light and dark primarily. And then the next step is they start to recognize red from the light. They can see reds instead of combining them together into the same group. They recognize that, and I think that's even true of babies. That's one of the first colors that they seem to recognize as well.
Is red?
Yes, red. And when you read
Hmm.
Homer 2, there's a really interesting description where one of the Greek commanders gets shot by an arrow during a truce, and the blood starts pouring from his armor briefly, and they compare that in a simile to a dye maker when they first put that dye color on a cloth and it sort of spreads over that white with the red. One of the few instances of color that we have in Homer's poetry, which is,
Hmm.
if you're not familiar, he's writing around 700 BC, one of the oldest pieces of literature that the Western world has.
Yeah.
So hopefully this is kind of like mind blowing because like color is such a basic thing that we grow up with. It's one of the first things that you learn in your first language, and if you do a second language, that's one of the first things that you also learn. But it's not always the same. These equivalencies are not always the same. And what I think is even more interesting is that that language difference even might determine how you view the world.
Yeah, like how they notice the different shades and tints.
Yes, yes, precisely.
Are they um why do you think their language is built like that?
I guess sort of maybe need has always been the first theory of like why you would need to differentiate this. And dark and bright are such a basic principle of your eye that you're able to catch right away. Is it dark outside? Is it bright outside? Because that's the essence of how color works or how light works in sight. And then from what I understand, often reds are the things that you need to watch out for.
Mhm.
Usually, things that are poisonous or deadly are a little bit brighter in color to kind of get you, because it's not good if a poisonous frog gets eaten and then kills you. Um, it didn't really work out for the frog. It's good that he tells you, "Hey, don't eat me," and then you just stay away from it altogether. So often in nature, these brighter colors are meant to help give a forewarning, like, please don't mess with this thing. It will kill you. So
Mhm.
that's the theory of the starting. And then usually green and blue usually takes a while to evolve because there's not really a need to differentiate the two. There's not a lot of different blue colors in the world, and
Like natural.
natural blue colors,
Yeah.
yes. And I don't think that there's any evolutionary motivation for why you would need to discern them. It's not like there's a blue jaguar versus a
Yeah.
green jaguar.
Well, what about the blue-footed booby?
A blue-footed booby, I guess, would be an example, but aren't boobies like so dumb that that's where booby trap comes from? Like
Is
they're
it?
really
I don't
easy to
know.
kill. I
Huh.
think I think that's like where they get their name is, or like someone who's a boob is an idiot because those birds are so dumb. So maybe that's like maybe a slight advantageous thing, and I don't know if there are some languages that go from there. And there's several others. I think we were talking about Inuits, for example. Did you want to explain that example that you
Yeah,
read?
we can. The Inuits are an Eskimo people. I don't really know too much about them, but when I was studying up the material for this conversation, I ran into an example that the Inuits have multiple words to describe snow. Like one of them was clinging,
Right.
um, and then wet snow. And in English, you can describe snow. There's
Mhm.
by using basic description words that you would describe anything else. But snow is just snow. There's
Yes.
not a specific word for snow. And also, I'll throw this in the ring because I studied Chinese for 4 years.
Hmm.
I'm just in school. And as we continue, I can throw in more examples from what I remember. But there's actually a word for 10,000, like
Uh-huh.
a separate word. You know how we group it into, hundreds, thousands, and then you would say 10,000s, then 100,000s. Um, there's a word for 10,000.
Yeah, we actually do have one in English. A myriad is 10,000. It comes from ancient Greek.
Oh,
But
really?
yeah, I don't think we use it quite enough. Same with a fortnight
That's
is
2 weeks.
2 weeks. But besides the game, I don't think that a lot of people know uh, that a fortnight means 2 weeks. Um,
I
so
thought it
when
meant a popular video game.
exactly, so when Abraham Lincoln says 4 score and 7 years ago, score is another example. It is another unit of time, but yeah, it just has fallen out of practice because we don't use it so much.
Hmm.
But something, and usually 10,000, I think in ancient languages often is sort of like a bajillion. Like, you don't really mean like a bajillion when you put that out there. You probably, like, we probably have never seen a bajillion, but it's sort of like such a massive number that it's synonymous with countless or
Yeah.
infinite, which is interesting.
By the way, I just looked it up, the word for 10,000. It is pronounced "wan,"
Wow.
and yeah, "wan." I'm probably butchering the tone marks because every single one is different. It's either like "one," "wan," "wan," or something like that.
That's interesting.
Um,
Chinese is a language I would like to know a little bit more, and Eastern languages in general. But go ahead. Sorry, didn't
yeah.
mean to interrupt.
Although what's interesting is for the description of the word, the definitions are 10,000, a very great number, and the third one says myriad.
Yeah, and an
So there
English word that we just don't drop a lot. We should work it back in. I think get myriad used a little bit more.
you go. Start a movement.
Exactly, and that's an interesting thing because too, the other thing that we often forget about is that language is a constantly evolving creature.
Mhm.
um, there's constant changes going on in language based around use and culture and need specifically.
It's
Um,
also colloquialism.
colloquialisms too, but eventually those colloquialisms become official language and they become things that are used today. I'll give you an example that kind of blew my mind. What's wrong with this sentence? My friend and me went to the store.
My friend and I.
Yeah, yeah, that sort of small grammatical thing that maybe if your English teacher hammered in enough that you guys can pick out a lot. Um, a linguist once told me that they predict in 50 to 100 years that rule's going to be dead. Um, that language will slowly evolve to remove that rule, and your English teacher will stop teaching it to you because no one really quite cares too much about it.
But
Um,
with that said, that makes me wonder, what is the point of rules and syntax in general, like grammar?
well, so I'll the reason why I love language, I'm a philologist, someone who loves language, is because it is simultaneously the most complicated thing that your brain can do, and also simultaneously the most common thing that you do every second of every day. And some people say, like, well, math's really hard, but math has 10 digits and you could do different things with those digits, but they stay the same no matter what. Language evolves constantly, so what might be one might be another word or might have a different meaning or have a different context in general.
Right.
um, the core is communication, and it sounds like a no duh, but
Yeah.
language is all about communication and explaining what you are experiencing to someone else who can't
Yeah.
experience it through your eyes. And the syntax, the rules that we deal with, are only in existence because we need some agreed upon common ground for explaining more complicated stuff, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yep, that makes sense.
One of my favorite things to teach is conditionals. If something happens, then blank happens. Because there's a conditional, which is grammarians call contrary to fact, which essentially creates a parallel universe. If something would have happened, I would blank. and it's only a slight change in the verb for most languages. A would have for one word, and in Latin and Greek, it's only a slight change in the mood of a verb, which is neither here nor there. But can you imagine like how that evolved, where someone needed to explain, hey, in the past, if something had happened, then this would have a different outcome, but it didn't, so we don't have that outcome. And trying to find like a common ground to explain that to someone. And then it happened. It slowly evolved to the point where we had to come up with a way to express parallel universes and timelines that haven't actually seen fruition.
Or just like explaining any sort of abstract concept.
Exactly. And it's again, language is just so complicated. One of my favorite philosophers in college, or philosophy teachers, I should say, in college, we read a book by Augustus. I forget the title of it off the top of my head, but in it, he's having an imaginary dialogue with his son, and they take like a basic sentence, like the storm came out of the sky, and he asked his son to pretend like he had no idea what words were and explain what each of those words represented. And there were things that were easy that he could show, like storm and sky, by just pointing at them.
Mm-hmm.
But then like the word out of gave him a lot of difficulty, because how do you show out of? And they theorize like, well, maybe I just walk out of the room. And then Augustin says, well, what if I think that's walking and I don't realize that it's the act of going out, or there's a movement from there?
Yeah.
Or I think that only I can do it. And it kind of stumped his son, because the thing that we're doing even now is years and years and years and years of evolution that your brain almost in a matter of years picks up and starts using with a tremendous accuracy and ability. That's mind-blowing to me. I think that's amazing.
Well, also what's even more, to continue that mind-blowing, one of the things I do just as a I guess it's like unconscious, it's just always going on, and I can't really stop it, so it's a blessing and a curse, but it's kind of looking at my situation that I'm in from an outside view, and just in a meta sense. Like, yes. I'm sitting here listening to you, listening to your words, but also acknowledging that I'm sitting here listening to your words. And it's also just weird to carry on with what you were saying. It's not only the words you're using or describing, but on the receiving end, it's, are you actually listening? Are you interpreting this in the way that the speaker is actually like trying to articulate?
Yeah.
Like, maybe I take something different from what you said because of my own experiences, or simply because I heard something wrong, or I wasn't paying enough attention, so I only heard snippets, so I interpreted it completely wrong or different. So it's just interesting how not only is language all about the proper articulation of your thoughts, but also how the receiving end, receives it, because that could be entirely different too.
And I think that's where you have these differences evolve, because it's not easy to get what you're experiencing fully across the board, give someone a perfect image of what you want to say. So there's this constant evolution, this constant changes that have been going on across the world in order to get an idea across. And going back to the Eskimo, the Inuit example of snow, it makes sense why there's so many different words for snow, because that's a constant part of their world, and it might make the difference between like shelter or death. But for us, we're pretty, capable of handling snow, and there's not this tremendous need to understand it.
Mhm.
So it's a weird balancing act of trying to come up with an objective truth. Language, I think, maybe if you want to think about it, is like trying to put an objectivity to the world when, sort of almost scarily, everything could be subjective, that
Yeah.
there's no clear example, like everyone can interpret something differently.
Yeah. And it's also interesting, similar to how the Inuits deal with snow on a daily basis. Think about you or me or the listener,
Mhm.
um, just from a normal, like, urban or suburban or even rural, but really just around the world. When you have your close connections of friends and everything, it's almost like the same thing as having different words for snow as the
Mhm.
Inuits do. But with your own connections, you develop things along the lines of inside jokes or something. And
Yeah,
those jokes are not only a sign of your connection, like the fact that you can joke about something, have it be a recurring gag. But if you think about it, those are also shortcuts to an allied understanding.
exactly. So
So it's more like a tool, right?
right, right. And or even like a connection, I would even say it's a relationship encompassed in something that you do automatically, because that means that word has a different relationship for the person who's in on the joke than someone who's outside of the joke. So
Right.
you could have a whole different language with a person on the inside versus the person on the outside.
Mhm.
Uh, One of my favorite dialects in the world is Cockney, from London, um, because it's actually a super duper complicated dialect. On the one hand, there's pronunciation differences, like mother is mother, and water, they leave out the T and stuff like that in
Oh, you mean
pronunciation.
like a real thick English accent?
That real thick Cockney accent. I don't know if I could do it, but like think of
Whoa.
Wallball, yeah, that type of a deal, like Kingsman. Who's the guy who plays Venom? He has a really good example of a Cockney accent. He was in like Inception.
Oh, I'm not sure.
I'm
I'm not
trying
the
to think.
biggest movie guy, I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries. Um, uh, I'll look it up really quick, just so if people want like a reference.
Alright.
Um, Listen to Tom Hardy. Tom Hardy's got a great Cockney accent. A really like simple accent. Now, most dialects stop there with pronunciation, but what Cockney accents do is they do a little rhyming thing that they do that originally came up because they wanted a secret code to talk with other people from the Cockney area. I'll give you an example. They might say, "Hey, brother, you got a phone," um, but instead of saying phone, they might say bone because bone rhymes with phone. Does
Oh,
that
okay.
does that make sense?
So it's an indicator for someone inside of the culture, and so they know exactly what you're saying, but someone on the outside can't figure it out, so it's a security thing?
Yes, and then they step the security step even further, that they wouldn't say, "Do you have a bone?" Because it might be too easy for someone who just knows rhyming to figure out, okay, it means phone, or mishear and say, "Oh, it means phone." But they'll do the first word in a sentence or in a rhyming clause. So if they are saying like a dog and a bone, they might say, "Hey, brother, you got a dog?" And what they mean is, "Do you have a phone?" Which, how the heck, if you're an outsider, would you realize that when someone's asking for a dog, they want your phone? um, and
Yeah, I'll pass on that.
yeah. And it slowly evolved because Cockney was these people were a little bit in the poor area and they were heavily policed, and they wanted some sort of language that they could use without being understood by outsiders. So language is a lot of, I think it's an interesting concept because it's heavily based on relationships and heavily based on use. And it's something that perforates our world but can change instantaneously. It is a tool, but it's like an all-purpose reality
Right.
tool.
Or also consider after exploration and globalization, um, which is also funny that I said globalization because I'm American, but I think that's the Canadian way to pronounce it. I always say I instead of I,
So what would be the American way?
like
Globalization?
globalization.
Globalization? Yeah,
Yeah, I would say
globalization. Yeah,
globalization.
right. Yeah. Okay.
Um, but I don't know. I don't have Canadian roots, but for the sake of consistency, yes, I do. So,
Okay.
um, uh, I was like, wait, where am I going with this?
Right.
So think about English and how much other languages have kind of found their way inside of our normal dialect. The one I can think of off the bat is et cetera.
hmm
Isn't that like a French word?
It's actually a Latin word. Etc. is and the others. So if you're
Oh,
coming
okay.
up with a list of vegetables, you say tomatoes,
Right.
potatoes, etc. In one word, you're encompassing and the others, a Latin phrase.
Yeah. And
Right.
also, I just in saying that sentence, I also brought up another point that is another valid thing to talk about. I said off the bat. We
Yes.
have so many, especially in America, like there are so many dang baseball references. Like I got to get all my bases covered, and you know, uh,
Like hit a
home
home
run.
run. Yeah, really slid in there. Yeah, they're and so language. I guess when we were talking about this is when we think about language, one of the first things we think about is how it's influenced by culture. But this idea of linguistic relativity is that language also influences the culture itself rather than culture influencing language, which we
Hmm.
think about.
So how
So,
would English influence baseball?
well, I imagine your speaker, if you're saying, well, I just came up with that off the bat, um, they would have to be somewhat familiar with baseball. So, if they want to use that language, they have to sort of inundate themselves into that world of sports. And, they might not have a certain team that they go with or a full knowledge of how the game works, but
Mhm.
they already are making that linguistic connection to the reality. Um, and idioms become sort of a cultural identity as well.
Yeah.
For instance, what do you call a carbonated drink? Can you give me what would you say?
Soda or pop?
Soda is a very Cincinnatian word. Down south, I'm originally from Lexington, Kentucky. Everything is a Coke. So even if you want Sprite, you just say, "Do you got any Coke?" or something
Well,
like
I think
that.
Sprite is owned by Coke, so that's kind of funny.
Right. And maybe that's sort of the connection there, but it's a linguistic, it's a cultural identifier too, that there's, you know, something about being part of this region that uses these unique ideas. Chili is often another thing. Some people from Texas who try skyline say, "Well, that's not chili," but for in Cincinnati, skyline chili is the chili, the quintessential chili,
Mhm.
which isn't. Yeah, so it's a symbol of identity. It's how you understand your world, and I think it often helps us think about the differences in slight different linguistic nuances, and what does that say about other people's identity to them.
True, because it's like, I think of chili with noodles and, uh, I don't
Cinnamon, not a lot of like peppers or anything in
know.
there.
No peppers, not really that many beans.
Right, where I think Texas chili is heavy on the peppers and the beans. It has a very spicy kick, where
Yeah.
Skyline's pretty mild.
Hmm.
So yeah, this weird who we are is determined by the language that we use, and how do we identify is determined by that language that we use, sometimes out of our control. You,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Right. So let me throw in this question for you specifically, just because if you explained it, it would be an interesting personal connection to our understanding in this episode.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, how has language influenced your perceptions? So start with English, and then when you started learning other languages, how has that actually shifted your way of thinking and your perceptions of the world?
So that's a good question. The poet Goethe once said, "To know one language is to know no languages," and I think that there's a lot of truth to that. If you only know one language, you're plugged into the matrix. That's the only thing that you operate in, and you're not really aware of how language influences your thought, right? Things are just that way because that's how they are. You don't know anything different until you start experiencing those differences full force, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, English, how that influenced my perspective, I think when I knew English, or English was the only language, I didn't really understand any ways that English influenced my perspective. It definitely did, but I wasn't aware because I was lost in the sauce. I was just, you know, inundated with it, and they didn't know anything different. Um, but one of the reasons why I like ancient languages so much is not only that the difference in space from country to country is so great, but you have this tremendous difference of time that's fossilized in this vacuum from our modern understanding, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, Ancient Greek is. I did learn Latin first, but I think Ancient Greek is where I first saw sort of like really different ideas of perspective just encompassed in the language. Just because it's so much older and often carries ideas that haven't had that modern influence. Latin is tremendously influential to our Western civilization, so
Yep.
it's not too hard to understand a Roman mindset, or to like operate in a Roman mindset and ignore some of the details. But ancient Greek, it kind of hits you right on the head. Um, and I guess you could start with vocabulary. There are certain words that just don't quite mean the same thing. There's not quite a one for one translation of words from English to ancient Greek.
And also,
Um,
real quick, just a quick
yeah, go
question.
ahead.
Is ancient Greek, like the language,
Yeah,
is that the same letter, like alphabet, as the Greek language now?
yes, same alphabet, but much different evolutionary wise, as maybe well, like Old English and Middle English is much different from modern languages. Are you
Okay.
familiar with any modern English or Old English?
Like, where they threw E's everywhere they could?
um, the biggest example of Middle English is the Canterbury Tale. Have you read that at all?
Isn't it like a historical thing?
It's a long poem where characters are going on a journey, and they sort of tell these stories.
Yeah, I could
And
not read that. Too many E's.
Well, let
Was
me
that
give
where
you
they said thy and thou?
a
In
little
person?
bit. Let me read you a line and see if you can pick out words. This is sort of one of the first things they could pick out. Here's the first opening lines. One that April with his shore suta, the drought of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vine in sweet liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flower. One Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath, the tender cropes and the younger sona, hath in the ram his half-course Hirona. Now, it sounds like I spoke maybe a different language, but you probably recognized individual words, right?
Yeah, kind of.
Any words that you think that you heard?
Was there a virtue in there?
There was a virtue, yes. Virtue is the word for power, virtue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was either March or Marsh.
March is in there, the drought of March, same
Okay.
word. A lot of those proper names, I guess, stand out. What I
Yeah.
said, Juan that April with his shura sota, when April with its sweet-smelling showers, the drought of March hath pierced to the rota, has pierced the drought of March
It
to the
sounds like you
root.
say perish.
Yeah, pierced is the word for pierced in Middle English.
Oh, okay.
So not too different, right? So
It's
it's
similar.
it's similar, yeah. You would sound very strange, but you could pick out certain words. Same
Yeah.
with ancient Greek to modern Greek. It's long
Okay.
tangent, but maybe this might expose the audience to like even just how English has evolved so much. And
And
that's
is it
middle
the word alphabet? Alpha, beta?
alpha beta, yes, because those are the first letters of the Greek word. Yeah, alpha beta.
Hmm.
So I guess going back to sort of my perspectives about like starting with ancient Greek, the first thing that you realize, I think, is like vocabulary. That's sort of a big shock. There's not one-to-one words, and that's sort of the most simplest words. I'll give you an example. There is no word for obey in ancient Greek.
Hmm. I
The
would think they would need that word.
they have something that we stand in for it, but it literally means to be persuaded by. So the closest thing to obey is to be persuaded by. And the thinking is that obeying can only come when someone has made it clear the benefits of doing something by
Okay.
either force or like logic. Does that make sense?
They still have to come to the conscious decision to agree.
Exactly. And actually, Alexander the Great kind of ran into this issue because when he started bumping into Persians who did have a word for obey, and this heavy hierarchy of kings and sultans, um, ancient Persia is very well organized with its hierarchy. He started trying to use the word obey for his men, and they did not like that one bit because it was super duper foreign just to their core beliefs. And
Okay.
and and that's shocking because like that's sort of their Greek identity then. Their identity comes from the language that they use. And again, they can't quite understand what it means to just obey someone because of the power differential. They even
Right.
saw like even if there was a power differential, maybe it makes sense to obey someone because they can do bad things and harm you or make your life miserable. But even then, there must have been some like rationality based on this word to be persuaded, pipinomy,
Yeah.
uh, which, yeah, kind of this first starting point is like the words. What are the words that we use, and how does that change things around? I
Right.
then I think the next step, if that makes sense, is cultural ideas. What are larger perspectives behind a culture? And again, ancient Greek was kind of the first insight, because my background, I was raised Catholic. That Christian background of doing good for others is just a natural right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people can agree, even if you weren't a Christian. I think because there's so much modern, globalization, that idea is pretty well, enticed, as well, subscribed to, I guess is the right word,
Yeah.
by everybody. In ancient Greek, not so much. A lot of why people do things is based around the idea of kleos, or reputation. What do people say about them?
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
the reasoning is because, a lot of death in the ancient world. And for an ancient Greek, what people say about you is your one way to escape death and become a little bit immortal. Sort of that idea that's in Coco, I think, is a lot of people get first exposed to this idea that you die a second time when everyone forgets who you are and nobody says your name and no one remembers you.
So it's just a legacy idea.
It's a legacy. And there's not really any, you know, necessarily good or bad. And sometimes even the bad might result in a legacy, that gets remembered. If
Uh-huh.
you look at a lot of ancient Greek heroes like Achilles or Agamemnon, they're not morally upright. They commit war crimes. They enslave people. They are very selfish people overall.
But even
And
morality is subjective.
exactly, and I think that's when I realized that there's a tremendous subjectivity to all our world. I think that almost everything is subjective. That the objective is really hard to come by, and we're kind of in our own box, and the only way that we could even get to objectivity is language and agreement and years of evolution kind of building up to that, if that makes sense.
And also I'd add that to to strive for objectivity, to
Hmm.
strive for the truth, the truest thing there is it involves an immense sacrifice of I would say everything.
Hmm.
And when it comes to the human nature, because to strive for the absolute truth, which is a concept so profound then that even I don't even know what I mean exactly. Like I can't define what the truth is, but for the sake of cohesion, it's just objectivity.
Hmm.
Like the true things, like how the world really is outside of our perceptions.
Correct. Like something universally agreed upon is probably what, like, Plato, the Greek philosopher, would see, is that he called these the forms, and the form of something like goodness or virtue is the characteristic that is universal to all examples, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but
So,
I wouldn't use the word agree because that involves a consensus. I'm just saying that
ah,
truth would mean is, not
yeah,
agreed upon. But
okay.
to truly strive for that, you have to sacrifice all of your pride, any incentive for your own gain or even the gain of others. So like even like doing good deeds or helping people that could get in the way of finding the truth. You you have to sacrifice all of your sins that you would commit, like envy
Hmm.
or I think I said pride already, or gluttony or greed. Um, it's just everything because I mean, think about people who write history. History is to preserve what happened so we can learn from it. And we trust it because we need to know the truth of the past. But think about like who writes history? Most of the time it's the victors. So there's always going to be some sort of a slant. And why would the victors why would they want to cut out their bias? If they cut out their bias of being the victors, then that would lead to a truth because we're being, we're being fair. We're looking at this from an outside view above our own. But most people wouldn't want to do that because, we're the victors. We won. We're going to write the history and we're going to show us as the good guy and then them as the bad guy.
Well, I would even argue that it's not even a conscious decision. Those
Right.
biases are ingrained. So the person who's
That's
writing from the
hard.
victor's perspective is just, they don't know the conquered perspective. They don't know the person who's been overcome's perspective. So they can't give justice to that side.
That's very true as well.
Yeah. So I think, I guess my question is, can you give me an example of like sacrificing to get to objectivity? Because I'm having a little trouble understanding that.
Well, I just mean so take that example of, how the victors might not even think about how the losers feel.
Hmm.
There might be some confirmation bias of when they say they want to look into it, they just ask specific cherry-picked people
Right.
to give them responses that confirm their assumptions. That's what confirmation bias is.
You're right.
So even if they look into it, they're gonna do it with a tilt, or they might not want to because it's like we're the winners, they're the losers. They don't have anything meaningful to say. And what I mean by sacrifice is essentially if we were to strip half of human nature, that's what's required to reach true objectivity because we're just very biased, tilted individuals. Like that's kind of part of the human nature, part of the human experience. So it's
Well,
almost, I guess now that I'm talking about it, it's basically impossible to reach objectivity just because we can't strip away our flaws, essentially. I guess
that
what I'm saying is perfection.
yes. And I was just about to argue it, and that idea that even part of it is just the human nature aspect, but I also think it's the nature of the world aspect. Can you truly have a fundamental, unbiased view of everything that encapsulates every truth?
Mhm. Oh, yeah,
Because
that's a limited knowledge too that prevents you.
exactly, like even if you could tap into the mind of every person who was experiencing a joint event, there's probably so much nuance in how everyone's sort of understanding it that, how can you put that to words? How can you put that together? So it's kind of like this is what we do on a fundamental level. I'll use the example of sight. um, your eyes are actually taking in a lot more images that you have, and your brain has to stop and cut out some of those images so your world makes sense.
Right.
Have you heard that idea? Are you familiar with that idea?
Well, it also reminds me of hearing where you have the ability to talk to your friend and listen to what he's saying at a loud party and cut out what everyone else is saying.
Right. You've been honed in. We as humans have to like rewrite our experiences all the time so we can make sense of the world and function in the world. That yeah.
And
Which
also
maybe
back to language, it's like to understand your experiences, the way you think is you think in language. So you're
mhm.
essentially speaking to yourself in that language. So that language has all of the word descriptors to describe how you feel. But most of the time, we experience such complex emotions that how can you even articulate that?
Yeah. It's so true that, and this is I think the fundamental thing that we've been trying to get at is that there's the biggest truth I think is that true objectivity is outside the human reach because of our nature. And because of that, just the subjectivity that we're prone to do, but
Hmm.
in our language is sort of our best fight against it. But even then, it's so limiting in its effects, though it's super complicated and manages to do so much. It can't quite get to that perfection of like true objectivity. That there's always some sort of relativism based off what you experience and what you can express.
Right.
Which I don't know. How does that make you feel? Does that make you feel, is that a scary thing? That there is no objectivity, that there's subjectivity?
It's weird, I'll tell you that. Um, but when I think of it is, even though we can't find the truth, it's impossible.
Hmm.
I think the takeaway, I guess, is that we should try to be more articulate in our speech and yeah, I'll leave it at that. Be more articulate in our speech just because that helps clear up some of the fog that might be prevalent in our lives.
Hmm.
Like, we need to understand language and exactly what we mean and define things and give definitions because inside of us, it's a jumbled mess that we need to articulate so we can describe it to people and those receivers understand exactly what they mean. And also, we need to be able to describe the jumbled mess that is everything outside of us, too.
That's good. I always worry and hope the reader or the listener like realizes, yeah, that they're, it might seem a little bit hopeless, but I really think that's the notion that we should come up with it, that there's also some sort of freeing power because we do have the tools, and this is the world that we are creating constantly, and we should strive for better articulation and better communication, and more appreciation for that.
Mhm.
So my hope is for everyone who learns language or has an interest in this language is that it empowers them to keep searching for ways to encompass these ideas and ways to express these ideas,
Yeah.
which I think that's the human nature, is that we're not a solitary species. We would go mad if we never talked or interacted or shared what we had with someone else.
Right.
Um, so we've constantly are trying to express ourselves and new ideas, and what does that look like for others, and not just language, but then it becomes art and it becomes music. I mean, how do you express feelings without even putting anything to words? Or we were talking about this, but like propaganda and advertising, how do get someone to crave McDonald's with the ba 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 ba? I'm loving it.
Yeah.
So it's a, I think that there's something hardwired in there for us to keep on seeking that out. That how do you, that continued negotiation of subjectivity and agreed upon truth, if that makes sense.
Right. And I guess just the takeaway is something anyone can do is just try to work on their speech, to work on that articulation, to basically just using their natural curiosity and will to improve and just understand people in the world better and themselves. Just paying more attention to everything, really, like,
Yeah, just
like
being.
the language you speak, the body language, that's very subtle, even
Uh-huh.
other subtleties, the subtleties of music, like you said.
I think like, yeah, that's a very good, like, we got to connect it back for the reader or the listener. I keep saying reader. I'm used to written language, classical languages, so that's why I keep doing it. But
Yeah.
I think it's important for the audience member, yeah, to have that linguistic awareness. And a lot of I think a lot of self-help starts with being aware of that language. If you're constantly using language that is negative or characterizes you as uh, something less than,
Like inferior or
yeah,
self-deprecation.
yeah, that self-deprecation helps determine what you're going to become. I'm not a self-help expert, but as a teacher, one of the first things that you learn is that there's something called there's a little bit of determinism in how you talk to students. That if you view a student as bad, 9 times out of 10, that guarantees that they will be bad. Or if you
Yeah.
view them as good, they're always going to turn out good.
I think,
And
therefore I am.
exactly, or someone thinks even about you, yeah, that think I I kind of have a gripe with that because I I think therefore I am is more about like how to determine your existence as a whole. But I
Yeah, yeah,
guess the
I'm
idea of
probably
like
not
a
using Descartes correctly here.
right.
I always turn to it when I think about it.
But as the right thing is true that like the one thing that you can do is like justify yourself. The
Mm,
other thing that I think is important too is the power of narrative. Um, you got a lot of young speakers and listeners on here, and one developmental concept that always happens is something called the personal fable, where until you reach a certain developmental age, you often picture yourself as the hero of a story,
mhm.
and you understand your life through a narrative. And the thing that is a little bit bad about it is sometimes you tend not to think that bad things can happen to you.
Right.
It has been like the view from there, but I might even argue that it, it could be used for good. It could be used to say, I think with this day and age, we have so much self-confidence issues, so much we're feel like we're faking it till we make it.
Yeah.
And maybe we need to tap back into that narrative and maybe not make an ultimate lie, but like speak
Well,
more
it's something to
accurately.
believe in.
Yes, yeah.
And
Eh,
belief, it's interesting to think that a belief could be a lie or synonymous with a lie because
mhm.
it's not exactly true. It's something you're just believing in.
Yeah,
Um, it could be faulty, but just believing in that can really bring you somewhere.
yeah,
And belief can be religious or spiritual, but really just if you believe in yourself that you can do something, that you
yeah,
can improve, that you're forever changing, but you can take control of that, the locus of control, the internal locus. You
yes,
can you can take control of your life, not blame things on outside things, even if they may actually be at fault. But if you take the hit and say, all right, I can't actually do anything about this thing that's affected me. But if I can bounce back from this or react in a constructive way, I
yeah,
can be better. And I suppose that's the narrative I have for this show.
yeah. And that's like, I think that power is important in realizing even then the fundamental way you talk about yourself and you talk about how you handle it helps determine that reality a lot.
Hmm.
So maybe that's something that the audience can grasp on when they're thinking about this is like that the language that they use to describe themselves and view themselves can essentially determine their their reality and
Yeah,
determine their success or their failure. And it's really important to cue into that language and be cognizant of it so that you could benefit from it rather than be hampered by it.
right. In other words, use words that help you rather than tear you down.
Yeah. And even just like honest assessment and sort of seeing where you are. I think it's so hard to take a compliment these days and ages. We tend to say, "Oh no, no," that's not me. That I didn't do my best, or there's still stuff there.
Right.
It's good to acknowledge, no, I did put my best foot forward and I did achieve my goals. And there might be stuff that I want to work on, but I did it. And
Right.
that can empower you a lot more than it can lead to better things, I should say.
Yeah.
Than if you're saying, well, no, I messed up on this and this and this.
Right.
I was told, I did a leadership class once, and I was always told that you shouldn't focus on what you need to improve sometimes. That the better thing to do is to really focus on your strengths, and the rest will come with it. Because if you're focused on what you fail at, you're going to be... Go ahead. You'll be overwhelmed by those failures, and then your strengths will start to diminish because you're spreading yourself out too much.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah. You gotta believe in your strengths.
Like the metaphor they often use is like a sword. Like, if you make everything sharp, nothing's going to work. If you make 1 point sharp, you're going to get through that obstacle. 1 point sharp, you're going to get through that obstacle well and easily. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot of great stuff.
Yeah. A lot to unlock.
Right. I mean, I bet I could sit here and spend another hour like I did with the more efficient one, but I think this is a good place to
I think so too, Casey.
Close off.
Yeah. Hopefully it's something of value to people and people appreciate it. I think that this is a good program overall.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, anyway, thanks for joining me, Mr. Minion.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And I guess, do you have any final quick thoughts before we end?
I think we covered it all.
All right. Sounds good. So, to the audience listening, thank you for doing so, and I'll see you guys next time.